Got it.
So I'd like to see two sources today, and maybe if we can discuss a little bit at the end. I've heard some ideas from a couple of people about what we should do next. So one source is in Hebrew, and we'll go through it, without reading every word and explaining. And the second source, I actually sat and had, with Google Translate's help.
No, not Google Translate. Not Google Translate.
That's half the job.
That's the worst the worst, I agree.
1 second. It does half the job. The easy words it gets right, and then I have to make the corrections, and I got half the job done, and half the job I have to do by myself. In any case, you'll see it soon. But that's the second source. Let's start with the first source that I'm sharing here. This is it. Okay. So this is a source from a halachic tshuva by Harav Dr. Azriel Hildesheimer. I discovered today that if you know in Tel Mon, there's a Moshav Azriel, it's named after him. He's one of the German rabbis, the Yekish German rabbis of Torah derech eretz. If I knew how to imitate a Yekish accent, I would, but I don't, so I'm not going to make a fool of myself. In any case, he was one of the leaders of Torah derech eretz, like the continuation of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in Germany in the 19th century, passed away in 1889. And what I wrote down here is interesting. What I found today is in the beginning of his rabbinic career, he was a rabbi in Hungary. Hungary was always a very extreme Haredi place, not always, but for the last centuries. And he opened a school where the really revolutionary thing that he did was that not only in addition to Limudei Kodesh, they also studied general studies, Limudei Chol. And so the extremists in Hungary were very much against him and saw him as being a great danger, worse than what are they called in English? Neologists, who were like a kind of certain, maybe even before the stronger reform movement, but they considered him to be more dangerous because you know them, they're just neologists. But him being Orthodox is giving legitimacy to actually studying general studies and being, involved and being assimilated into general culture. So some of them considered him to be more dangerous. And in 1873, when there was a big question, the rabbis once made a how do you say, a cherem, they kind of, sorry?
To put somebody in to ban somebody.
Yeah, like they made a ban against opening schools.
Right.
Because the kids would go to school rather than go to Talmud Torah. So in 1873, someone opened a school in Jerusalem, and Rabbi Hildesheimer supported it from Europe. So one of the fanatics compared him to a pig, because the pork, is there in the animals. We have certain simanim of being kosher or not kosher. So one siman is in the hooves if they're not complete, but they're separated, and the other is in the digestive system. And the pig has the external siman in the hooves and does not have the internal digestive system siman. And so the pig is always just a symbol of being like hypocritical, as if he's trying to show his hooves externally as if I'm kosher, and he isn't really kosher, because in the hidden things you don't see about his digestive system, he's not kosher. So that's what they compared Rabbi Hildesheimer to. So I read that, and it actually put a smile on my face, because I said, okay, it doesn't start in the 21st century, and these struggles have been around for at least 150 years, if not more. So it was just interesting to read that about him. And now we are going to see a tshuva of his about...
Is there a street in Jerusalem called Hildesheimer? Pretty sure there's a street named after him.
Oh yeah, there are streets named after him in a few places.
Okay.
And actually the present CEO of Ra'anana municipality, his name is Azriel Hildesheimer. I think I asked him once if he's related. I don't remember if he said yes or no, but in any case,
Yeah.
yes. In any case, this is a tshuva about the halachic status of a person who is deaf. Deaf in halacha is compared to shoteh, to a person who doesn't have his right mind, meaning he cannot perform all kinds of halachot, all kinds of halachic requirements. He's considered to be a person who is not cognitively in order, doesn't have cognitive capabilities. And then what happened is that at the end of the 19th century, they came up with this with sign language. And because they came up with sign language, people, and we're talking about in halacha, people who were both deaf and dumb, meaning a person who could speak but was deaf had greater abilities, but a person who was both deaf and dumb couldn't study, couldn't understand things, couldn't hear, couldn't speak, and therefore was considered like a shoteh. And then when they invented the sign language and began to teach deaf people sign language, and so maybe they couldn't hear and maybe they couldn't speak properly or speak kind of partially, but they could be absolutely, totally intellectual people. And so it became a halachic discussion in the second half or towards the end of the 19th century that the rabbis were beginning to discuss what is their halachic status. And you see, he says this at the beginning in Hebrew. What do we say about them? That you see that he doesn't have the ability to hear. He has the chisaron of chusha shmi'ah, but his brain is sechel, midat sichlo v'avanato b'masa u'matan, ikel shel kol bnei adam ha'pikchim. His ability in business is like any other intelligent person. So he brings different rabbinic opinions about it, and he says there are those who say that he's like a person who has total cognitive abilities. The second opinion is that he's totally like a shoteh, nothing has changed. And there are those who couldn't make a decision. they said safek. They said, we're not sure. And what is the safek? And we'll see that in a moment. It's a very interesting way how they present the safek, the doubt. The doubtful about whether he should be considered like any other rational person with rational abilities or not. And he brings Chaim Itzanz, who says that if they can speak, even if they can speak a little bit, even though when they speak, sorry, I just made a mess. 1 second. Just made the words jump.
Hello? שלום, היי.
Somebody joined us.
היי, תודה רבה שחזרת אליי. תודה רבה. אז קודם כל תודה רבה על התשובות והכל. אתה מכיר את יגיל אוסם?
רגע. Participants. Mute all. Okay. Everyone is muted. You can hear me, yes? Okay. So when you want to speak, just lay yourselves out of the mute. Okay. So he says, even if he can speak a little
אלון
bit.
מצוי?
Today is problem day with the Zoom. Okay, we're okay now.
She's in the wrong place.
Okay, so if they can speak, and even if they speak a little strange, but they are considered to be people who can speak. So they are considered like human beings. Like one of the definitions of a human being is called in medieval philosophy, a human being is called a medaber, one who speaks, because that is one major thing that differentiates us from animals. And therefore he says he can do kiddushin, he can marry a woman, and he can give a divorce, and all kinds of other things. And then he says, liot shub. You know what a shub is? Everybody know what shub is? Shub is shochet uvodek.
Shofet uvodek, right? Shofet uvodek.
The person who checks if after the shchita, if the animal was kosher, there weren't any diseases that make it not kosher, and so on. He says he shouldn't be. And if you come to a situation of chalitza, if a person died, if a man died without children, and his brother, he has a brother, and the brother should do chalitza for the widow, and he says not to do chalitza, it's better to do yibum. In that case, very difficult. But he's a little in between. On the one hand, he says yes, if they can speak, then they can do all kinds of things that are considered deoraita, but not everything. So it's not absolutely clear how far is he going. Those who didn't make a decision, he says, he brings them Aram Shik, and he says that it's possible, even though you see that he's talking, he says maybe it's just like a monkey. Maybe it's like, he says a monkey, like you can teach a monkey to dance, but it doesn't mean that he has a mind. You know, it's like the story about the cat that could walk and serve like a waiter, but once you have to do to prove that it's just that he's been how do you say, like an animal that's been like in a circus, that's been trained.
It's a trained animal.
Is all you have to do is let a mouse out and he drops the tray and runs the mouse. So he says maybe that's the situation here, or it's like I would compare to a parrot who knows how to speak, right? He can say certain sentences. It doesn't mean that he has a mind, so that he has the mind of a human being. Or so this Maharam Shik says maybe the fact that he can talk is just external, and it doesn't mean that he has bchira chofshit, that he has an opinion, that he has the human capacity of free choice and so on. And he says it's a safek. And he says, so for this, yes, for this, not. He's not sure. And then he brings this, and he says the following. This is the most fascinating sentence that I found in this tshuva, is the following. It says, it seems to me that ikar davar, the main issue here, is the question whether the cognitive ability, koach hasecher, the brain of a deaf person, is absolutely not the same as a regular person. There's something lacking in his brain and his cognitive abilities, or his brain is normal. It's just like it's hidden from us. It's an otsal ganuz. It's like a treasure that's hidden somewhere and we can't reach it. Does a deaf person have a totally regular brain? Just we can't get to it. He has abilities, but we can't get to them. Or is his brain different? His brain has disabilities. There's something wrong with his brain. Maybe you can teach him like you train a monkey to talk or a parrot, but his brain is not the same as a human brain. It's fascinating to see this, because today, I don't think anybody scientifically would raise this question. We know scientifically today that something is impaired in his ability to speak. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with his ability to think, to understand. And if once, I'm sorry, they have turned off my lights and air conditioning. 1 second, excuse me.
Comedy of errors.
Yeah.
Maybe difficult, but people overcome difficulties. It's persistence and determination.
Right.
Okay. זה בסדר. סגרתי את הדלת בגלל אנחנו באמצע שיעור. תודה. לא. תשאירי כך. Okay, we can continue. Tonight is the night where we have all kinds of challenges and we have to overcome them, like a person who's deaf and has to learn sign language. But at the end, he has all of the regular human abilities, And in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, in the last quarter of the 19th century or so, they were questioning this issue. This was a question. And this is the halachic discussion that they were having. Is this just external, that he's taught, he's trained to perform certain external actions, or does he have a brain like other human beings? And so this discussion continues in different ways. And here he brings another rabbi who says that nothing has changed. Why does he say nothing has changed? In other words, the fact that the deaf people are now learning sign language and can maintain a rational intellectual discussion and can do business, perform business like anyone else, he says that doesn't mean anything. Why? Because our rabbis, the authorities of the halakha and the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they knew about the ability to, it's not the first time in the history of halakha that deaf people can say a few words. They always knew that they can have some form of speech, but they decided that that does not bring them up to the level of being people who have regular cognitive abilities, and they are not considered like the regular people according to the Torah. So therefore, the fact that today they were taught, sign language doesn't change anything, and nothing has changed. These are different opinions that Arav Hildesheimer is bringing. He brings all these different opinions, and here he says, now he starts to express his own opinion, and he says that was the way that doctors thought about it in the past. They thought that they don't have cognitive abilities, and if they can speak a few words, that's the most that they can reach. That's the maximum that they can reach, and it doesn't mean that they have regular human cognitive abilities. But he says afterwards, their opinion, the medical opinion changed, the scientific opinion changed, and they reached the opinion that he does have a regular brain, but it's difficult to bring out its potential. And then he says, in our generation, it has been proven from experience that they do have this ability, and it does not contradict what the rabbi said in the past, those great authorities of halakha, because in their time, they didn't have the scientific abilities to bring out their potential. So therefore, they could not be considered regular human beings with cognitive abilities. But today, we do have that ability, so they are regular human beings like anyone else. And there is no doubt, he says, but then there are these rabbis who are opposing my opinion that we should consider them as people who have regular abilities. And it's because they say that you are undermining the tradition of what we got from Chazal. And he says, absolutely, scientific knowledge does not have the power to undermine something that Chazal have from tradition. But that's not the question that we're discussing here. The question now is not about what was Chazal said right or wrong, but is our reality the same as Chazal or not? And he says, no, Chazal were right in their time and what they saw. But now we have a different kind of deaf person. The deaf person in the past could not develop his cognitive intellectual abilities and therefore could not perform all the mitzvot like other people. But today, the deaf person can develop his intellectual potential. And therefore, today, we should consider him as a person like all other people. So that's an example. You see the different opinions amongst the rabbis. You see that some of them say, yes, you see that he has abilities. Some of them say, well, I'm not sure. Are those really abilities? Or is it just external things that he can perform? It doesn't mean that he has regular human capabilities. And then there are opinions that say, no, absolutely not. The rabbis in the past knew that he can develop certain abilities, but he's not the same as other human beings. And you see this argument going on. The maybe fascinating, maybe disturbing issue is that the argument, to a certain extent, continues until today. For instance, for marriage, do they need special kinds of marriage which are not the same as others, or can they perform regular marriages? right? And I want to show you a different source now. Let's see.
Oh.
Can I find it? Yes. Here I have, show you this as well. Here I have one second, I will share it. We have already in the past mentioned of Ben Ilau. This is another one of a kind of mini series that Ben Ilau wrote under the auspices of the Israeli Institution of Democracy, Hamachon Israeli LeDemokratia, about equality between different people. And here he has a booklet about the issue of, can you perform marriage through sign language? Can a man sign, can the groom sign language to the bride? Is that acceptable? Can the witnesses testify that we saw him say to her through sign language, and so on? And one of the interesting things that Rav Ben Ilau brings in this booklet is, I will scroll us down to the point where he discusses this, is right here. You see in the Gemara, in Masechet Yevamot, the Gemara says that it's clear that a deaf person, the Cheresh in the Gemara, has a what they call data klishta. He has a little bit of a mind. He has a little bit of intellectual cognitive abilities. And we are doubtful whether that's enough to consider him a person who has enough capabilities to be considered like everyone else or not. That was the dilemma in the time of the Gemara. So what Rav Ben Ilau is showing us that they even then in the time of the Gemara, they didn't consider him to be the same as a shoteh. He's different. He was put in the same category, but not totally, because they saw that even then they saw that deaf people had greater abilities than a person who's totally, not rational, not capable in his intellectual abilities. And here he brings another source in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. It says the following: you're coming to town on Shabbat, and you weren't traveling by plane or by boat or by car. You were walking and you had a donkey or a mule with you, and you're coming to town, and what can you do? It's sunset already. Shabbat is coming in, and you didn't make it to town. Either there was a traffic jam on the way, or there were the airport was all backed up with terrible lines like we hear about today, or you miscalculated the pace that you can walk, or whatever it was. It's a couple of hours, it's still a couple of miles until you get to town. And now it's sunset and Shabbat is coming in, and you have with you, amongst other things, you have your wallet, your purse, you have money, you have your credit card and so on, you have muktzeh. And you can't carry it. Not only do you have muktzeh, but you can't carry it. You're not in the town, you're not in the Eruv. What do you do? So the Gemara says the following. This is very interesting. You have a mule and a cheresh and a shoteh and a katan. You have a child under bar mitzvah. You have a mule. You have a person who's deaf, and you have a person who is not capable intellectually. So the Gemara says, put your things on the mule, because the others are human beings. The mule is just an animal. It's better that the animal carries it rather than any human being, even if he's just a underage or a shoter or a cheresh. What do you do if you have a cheresh and a shoter? You have a person who's deaf and a person who's totally incapable intellectually. You put it on, you give it to the shoter. Shoter v'katan, shoter. Because if you have a shoter and a person who's not bar mitzvah, I don't want the child to grow up knowing that once they made him the person who exempt from mitzvot, then no, it's better to give it to the shoter. But look at this, cheresh v'shoter, they're not the same. Even in the time of the Gemara, the cheresh was different. He was on the one hand, put in the same bag with Cheresh, Shoteh, Katan. But when you had to say, is there a difference? You said, no, it's not the same thing. Cheresh has greater abilities than the Shoteh. So Ben Ilau is saying, his point is that even in the time of the Gemara, the Cheresh was not considered the same as the Shoteh. And in the modern world, we have grown in our scientific, medical, whatever it is, abilities to bring out the full intellectual potential of this person who can't hear or couldn't speak, but we have brought out his full intellectual abilities, the same as any other human beings, and that is how he should be considered the same as other people. And the fact that the word cheresh appears in the Gemara and the word cheresh is used today doesn't mean that we should think of these people as being the same and in different historical times with different abilities of bringing out human beings' potential. So that's another interesting discussion of can we have someone being equal to everyone else given a certain scientific development or human development and capabilities that we can make them improve throughout history. So I'm going to stop now, and yes, please.
There was a rabbi at YU that was totally blind, and he had his.
Rabbi what?
There was a rabbi at YU that was completely blind,
Yes.
and he had students that studied with him. He was ma'avir shiur. I knew everything by heart. It was amazing.
Yes. There is. He's still alive. There's a rabbi who is. I don't think he does that now, but he was a high school homeroom teacher, mechanech.
Where?
High school in Yeshivat Nechalim.
Ah.
He was one of the mechanchim in Yeshivat Nechalim. Now you would think with, a professor in university, the students are interested in studying, but in yeshiva high school, and you have to discipline these teenage boys, and he did it. He did it. It was amazing. And
Amazing
person. And once when I was the Rosh Yeshiva, the principal of the Yeshiva High School, some 10, 12 years ago, one of the teachers had been a student of this rabbi. I'm trying to remember his name right now. It's not coming back to me. Was his student in high school and wanted to bring him to his students. So we brought him out one day. He went and picked him up and brought him he lives in Nechalim, and brought him to the yeshiva that was outside of Beit Shemesh. And after he met with the boys, and afterwards I took him home, from Beit Shemesh to Nechalim on my way to Ra'anana. And he spoke to the boys, and it was fascinating. And he wears glasses. And high school kids, sometimes teenagers, they don't have certain how do you say
restraint, shame.
Yes, in their question.
Tact.
So asked him, why do you wear
That's
glasses?
it.
Awareness.
Tact.
One of the boys asked him, why? Sorry, restraint. What was the word?
Tact.
Tact.
Tact. Yeah.
There was-
So one of the boys asked him, why do you wear glasses? Took off his glasses,
so he wouldn't look blind.
and you took off his glasses, and you saw that his eyes were distorted in certain ways.
Of course.
It looked more strange, and with glasses that were a little bit with a dark kind of
Right.
painted and not just see-through. So he looked better, and when you met him, it was more pleasant to talk to him. It was fascinating. I took him home. It was fascinating talking to him on the way. He told the boys the story. He was born with full sight. He was, playing when they were teenagers, playing with a friend. A friend hit him, and that made him blind for life. Terrible.
Wow.
But he has written halachic books. He has written books for schools to use in teaching certain parts of Limudei Kodesh. He's done so much with his life. He did not sit home
Amazing.
and make a misken of himself. And when I dropped him off next to his house, he's been living in this house for decades, and he walks into his house like all of us do.
Yeah, he knew the way. So nice.
To let him off, and he just runs into the house like nothing. It was so fascinating to meet him and to see this. Yes, it was definitely very interesting.
I was gonna ask, but I think you've settled the question very nicely. Supposing there's a person who, is very highly respected, has great knowledge, is fantastic Talmid, and everything is hunky dory. But then this person gets old, and they get a little, they get forgetful, they get senile. It happens to us. I forgot. I don't know what your name is. And so I mean, does that mean that that they become disqualified either suddenly or gradually?
The question is, you can ask it from that direction. And it's also a question about, some people, clearly their cognitive or intellectual abilities are impaired to the level where they are not, they don't understand enough to be able to perform a mitzvah or something like that. Maybe they can even externally, hold a lulav and shake it, but they cannot be a shaliach tzibur. They can't be the person who performs a mitzvah for others in the community and things like that. It can be but then there are different levels. So where do you draw the line? And you're asking it, Mark, from the place of a person who has the capabilities and gradually loses them. In the Gemara, they make a differentiation between a person who was born with hearing and then became deaf, and a person who was born deaf, because they assume that a person who was born with hearing is an intellectual person, and then when he loses his hearing, his capability of speaking and understanding things has not changed. But a person who was born deaf, they assume doesn't have the same brain. That's what we were discussing before. So they think of that differently. But I would say today, with our knowledge, a person who is losing his capabilities, it's a question, where do you draw the line? Yes, and we would have to check it by discussing things with this person. Can you, you have a discussion, you raise a certain intellectual discussion. Do they know, when you say a bracha, like I'll give you an interesting example. In the Gemara, there's a discussion, in Gemara and Masechet Brachot, they say that a child under bar or bat mitzvah can join a zimun for Birkat HaMazon, to say, not just for every individual to say Birkat HaMazon on their own, but to have people come together as a zimun, and we say a specific, a few sentences about blessing Hashem together, Rabotai Nevarech, or Gvirotai Nevarech. Yehi Shem Hashem Borach. We praise Hashem together. There's a higher value, like a minyan, when we pray together, when we say Birkat HaMazon together. So you need at least 3 people for this. And what if there are 2 grown-ups and the child who's under bar or bat mitzvah? So the Gemara says, if Katan hayodeh lemim mevarchim mitztaref lezimun, a child who knows who we are blessing in Birkat HaMazon can be the 3rd person. 3 children can't do a zimun, but if you have 2 grown-ups and a child under bar mitzvah, but he knows who we are blessing when we say the bracha, that can make a zimun. Halakha lema'aseh, this is a big machloket between the Rambam, the Sephardi tradition of Psika and the Ashkenazi. The Sephardim have a child join, they do it practically. The Ashkenazim generally did not act that way. And I always ask myself, okay, what do you do if one grown-up is Sephardi, one is Ashkenazi, and then you have a child? Okay, does the child join or not? His mother is Sephardi, his father is Ashkenazi. But in any case, the Gemara says he can join. And so what does it mean that he knows who we bless? I would say a 3-year-old, even if you ask him, who do we say the bracha to say Hashem? I don't know, does he understand? You have to be able to ask him a few questions. Who is Hashem? What did Hashem do? Now, does he have to be the deepest philosopher? Does he have to finish the Guide of the Perplexed of the Rambam to join Zimun? So Rav Kook says, even grown-ups don't really know who Hashem is when you say, bless Hashem. Okay, define Hashem. Even grown-ups don't know. And therefore, says Rav Kook, that's why children can join. Because the grown-ups don't know who Hashem is either. So all you have to have is that basic ability of understanding there's something above us, some greater power who created the world, and that's enough, and you can join the Zimun. So I would say, if you ask this person, whether it's a person with partial intellectual abilities, or a person who's sadly deteriorating and losing some of his abilities, if they come into shul and they hold the siddur and they know where we are in the tefillah and they make a blessing, and you ask them, what day is it? And they'll say Shabbat. And what are the rules of Shabbat? And they'll say, we're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. And who are we praying to? To the Hashem who created the world. Okay, yes, they can join. They can join, in whatever it is that you want them to do, they can join. Once they, I think of our dear friend, Morris Wysotsky, Zichrono Livracha. Towards the end, he was being brought to shul by his helper, by his son-in-law, by his grandsons. And, you saw the personality was there when he gave you his jovial Shabbat Shalom, but intellectually, he was no longer there. So no, I wouldn't, at that point, I would say no. So, there are all kinds of situations where you have to ascertain, yes, what is this situation? You have to ask a few questions to understand where that person is at.
Can you count that person in a minyan?
I wouldn't. At that point, I wouldn't.
It's a problem for an aging population.
Yeah. Yes.
So wait, the child can be counted for the three, amongst the three, there's the Emunah?
According to the Gemara, yes. According to the Rambam, yes. According to Rabbi Yosef Karo, yes.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
I'd also like to, maybe we don't have time to explore this, but I read a fascinating book a couple of years ago called The Flexible Brain, or The Brain That Fixes Itself, or something like this. And this is a fascinating account of people, for example, who have been blind from birth, and yet who have, their brain still has the visual, a large part of the brain is related to seeing. And so that part of the brain was not being used properly because it wasn't being stimulated by sight. However, these people could be trained to quote unquote see by being fed stimuli in such a way that would not stimulate their eyes, but it would stimulate different feelings, different sensory perceptions in their body. And the part of the brain that was geared to vision became active under those circumstances. Absolutely amazing. And so when we say, does the person have, the brain, or they have only half a brain? No. The brain is far more flexible than we give it credit for.
And today, technology is, in hearing, technology has done more than in seeing so far. Meaning today, technology can give a person who's born totally deaf, maybe it depends on exactly what's missing, but certain people at least can give them total hearing through technology. You make up for that missing link in their hearing abilities, and they'll always need the technology. So far, as I know, medicine medical technology has not been able to grow that part that's missing and implant it in the body, but can implant in the body the technology that's necessary to hear. Not the ability to see, but they are working on it, and they've reached certain levels of what I read once was that a person who was born blind can then discern the difference between a wall and a window, which is amazing. If you can do that, that means it's somewhere down the road they're going to be able to implant something in their eyesight and they'll be able to see. But in the meantime, what they can do is they give a person an ability to be aware of objects in their surroundings, and they put on a certain machine on their head or something, and they become aware of things like you say, using certain abilities. And when you said the flexible brain, I thought you were going to mention something else, and that is Professor Reuven Feuerstein. Professor Reuven Feuerstein, Zichrono Livracha, is an American ole to Israel, and conducted fascinating research on Down syndrome, and proved that Down syndrome, a child born with Down syndrome, does not mean he has reached his full capacity. You can work with him, and his intellectual abilities can grow. He is not going to become 100% like other people, like people who are born without the Down syndrome, but he can develop intellectual abilities, and sometimes up to the level that he can study, he can go to school, he can finish high school. Maybe he's not going to be, cynical to say, a brain surgeon, but he can develop certain intellectual abilities, and maybe also religiously, halachically, up to a level that he can be considered as part of the community. And he went around the world and made a revolution in the way that people think about children who are born with Down syndrome. His son, Harav Rafi Feuerstein, continues the institution that the father created. And the amazing thing is that the son of Rafi had a son who was born with Down syndrome. So Professor Feuerstein had a grandson who was born with Down syndrome, and they were all ready to work with this kid from day one. But
Very interesting.
fascinating. And he has changed, he has revolutionized the way the world thinks about a person who was born with a certain intellectual disability, but we can work on it, maybe not reach 100% of other human beings' capabilities, but you can grow. It's not stagnant where it was when he was born.
Rabbi, it strikes me that you've covered a number of interesting things here. Yes, we know that there will always be new developments in how you measure things. But what we started with anyway, it seems to me, was really about how do you measure intelligence? How is that brain in your head actually working? And, several thousand years ago, when we didn't know how to perhaps train people to communicate better, nobody could measure. And we see people with strokes today that have what's called a locked-in syndrome, where, they're in there, their brain still seems to be working, but they can't communicate, which has to be as frustrating as anything you can think of. So then I guess the question is, and you've helped a little bit with that, how do you set the bar of where, if they're over that bar, they're going to be acceptable into the community, and if they're less than that, they're not. I mean, I know plenty of people personally who hear very well, speak very well, and have no cognitive ability whatsoever. But that's a different question. In America, if you get old enough and have loss of cognitive ability, they make you president. So it's a different thing.
What happens?
Watch the politics here.
Had to throw it in. I had to.
What happens if a blind?
It's not clear which of the two presidents he met, so I'll leave it open.
What happens if a person is blind, but he can read Braille and he can read from the Torah? Let's assume they prepare for him a section.
So we discussed this about a blind person having an aliyah, because the aliyah Torah demands reading from the Sefer Torah. So we said initially he can't, but then the halakha says that since today we have a bar koreh, and the person doesn't read for the community himself, but hears it from the bar koreh, so the blind person can hear it from a bar koreh as well. But you can't, but again, there are certain restrictions, certain boundaries or frameworks are in place for specific halachot, like reading from the Torah. You have to be able to read, you have to be able to see and read from the Torah, or to hear the person who's reading from the Torah, and so on. And other places, it's the intellectual capability of understanding, like I said before, understanding what does it mean when we bless Hashem. Again, none of us understand what it means when we bless Hashem. We don't understand what is Hashem, but we understand from a human point of view that we are blessing some greater power that we believe created the world. So if a person has partial capabilities on his intellectual, relating to his intellectual level, but enough to say that he understands what a bracha is and what a mitzvah is, then at least where that's relevant, then yes, he can be included. This coming Sunday, we now announced on Shabbat, and I sent out an email today in Hebrew, an email and a WhatsApp about this evening that we're having on Sunday, this coming Sunday at Yad Labanim, which is the result of two organizations. The rabbinic organization, Rabbanei v'Rabbaniot Beit Hillel, that Osher and I are part of, has created a how do you say,
panel? A panel?
No, a track kind of where there are rabbis, men and women, who are working on what's called in Hebrew negishut, which is accessibility. All related issues of accessibility. One of them is having a Shabbat elevator, or having an elevator in the first place, and not just staircase where a certain person who has a certain physical disability can't go up the steps, or can't on Shabbat or whatever. So that's one kind of accessibility. And in Hebrew, it's called negishut. And as I said on Shabbat, the negishut is in this track, call it within Beit Hillel, within Beit Hillel is called negishut, as the word shut, shelot utshuvot, the abbreviation, shin vav taf, which is shelot utshuvot, which is halachic and religious questions about, bye, Michael.
Bye-bye, sorry.
Okay, we passed the time.
Okay.
About halachic and religious questions. Are we upside down, Mark? About religious questions about Beit Knesset, and I asked people to send me things, and a few people have sent me about noise in shul, and then how it, for certain people it makes their mind go crazy, or about a person who, like you mentioned, Mark, a person who is losing their capabilities. How do we make sure, as long as this person has even partial capabilities, how do we make sure to enable this person to come to shul and help them? Or on the other side, a child, maybe it's a young child, or maybe it's a person with limited intellectual capacities and doesn't know how to handle themselves in shul. So do we say, Father, don't come to shul because your child is going to be disruptive? Or do we say, community, be more inclusive so that father and son can come to shul, So these are issues we're going to be discussing. This is an evening in Hebrew in Yad Labanim this coming Sunday. But preparing this for tonight, I was thinking about that. This is the very issue. Where do you draw the line? And one of the questions, and we're not going to get to the second source, was I worked on translating today, but it's fine. I have it, and maybe we'll use it in the future. One of the questions is, there are two kinds of roles the rabbi can have. The rabbi can perceive his role, and the community, actually. The rabbi and the community can say, oh, we want to be a serious community. I want to be a serious rabbi. I'm going to draw clear lines where you cannot come in. You can't come into shul and to my shul dressed in this way. You can't come to my shul if you behave this way, and so on. And it's legitimate. There are places where I would do that as well. But another role of the rabbi is, take an example from Arav Ben Ilau, is to write a series of little booklets on where we can be more inclusive of a person, of the blind person who needs a guide dog, of the deaf person who wants to get married, of the Kohen who is now in a wheelchair, can he say Birkat Kohanim? And he has dealt with these issues. And it's a wonderful thing that this is rabbinic leadership of how to be more inclusive and use technology and modern abilities so that we can be more inclusive than we were in the past. So, I'm looking at these different aspects and not only asking the question, does Judaism treat all people equally? But maybe the question should be, what is the responsibility of us, of Jews, rabbis and lay people, to make sure that we are maximizing the ability of as many people as possible to be included. Maybe it can't be everyone for everything. Nothing in the world is everyone for everything. But can we push forward and enlarge our ability of being inclusive?
Okay, sounds good.
Well, I know I haven't been there, but in some of the, I guess, conservative or reform schools in the US, they have people that do sign language during the service also.
That's nice.
I was saying, I think I mentioned this once in the past, for Shavuot, 1 year after I had been in one of the workshops or something, meeting of Beit Hillel, dealing with these issues of being inclusive and so on, I suddenly came to my mind that maybe there are deaf people who don't come to Shavuot, to the learning, because
they can hear.
They can't hear, and maybe you're sitting too far away to be able to read lips and so on, or maybe the people delivering the
Right.
shiurim are not aware enough, etc. So I actually approached through the municipality to look for someone who would be willing to sign language, and maybe they would know who to turn to invite them to come to the shiurim, to say we are having sign languaging in our shiurim and Shavuot. But the answer I got was that they're not interested. I'm not sure that we have done enough in that realm. Meaning maybe they're not interested because they don't know that we're offering. Maybe if we offer more, then there will be one person who will come. And maybe if one year there's one person, maybe the next year there will be 5 people. And who knows?
In Yad Abanim, yeah.
Maybe we have to be more pushing more proactively to make this happen.
There was somebody that came, an interpreter for the deaf and the blind. No, for the deaf, she came and she was fantastic. She showed us. I mean, in 2 seconds, she showed us some of the sign language. But she was translating everything in court. It was amazing how she was able to do that, and it was very interesting. So maybe, and there are other people like this. I'm sure there are other
Well,
interpreters.
I
that do that.
wonder if there are like some schools of sign language, people that are studying at university or something
They
that would love
are,
to
they-
volunteer their time to do
Right.
that. And it would
That's a
go
good-
toward their grade or something. I mean,
Yeah, it's a good idea to check it out.
You have to
Sure.
know that there's a different sign language in different languages.
Languages, definitely. That's what she said.
English sign
Yes.
language is
Yeah,
not the
yeah.
same as
that's
English.
true.
sign.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
much more complex than
Right.
you imagine.
It's not, we are not experts on sign language, but I think the idea of the shiur, if we can come out from this whole series and maybe from this shiur, the thought that it's not, the question is not only does Judaism treat all people with equality, but do Jews proactively do something to make Judaism more inclusive, and creating equality is not an all or nothing. And maybe it's not right. We don't have to reach full equality because yes, there are some places where certain disabilities are relevant, but are we working to make Judaism more inclusive, more people capable, enable more people to be part of what is happening within the Jewish community? Maybe even changing the headline is part of the message.
Okay,
And I think we'll end with that.
okay.
So thank you for your efforts because
Thank you.
it's
Very
always
nice.
for granted, but today even more than usual.
Good night.